Have you ever paid attention to the warning labels on things? There are warning labels that you would never expect to need a warning label for, but they have one. For example, there's a warning label on a chainsaw that says, "Do not hold the wrong end of the chainsaw." Free advice, by the way. There are sun shields people put in their front windshield of their cars, and the purpose is to keep the car from getting hot, but the warning label says, "Do not drive with the sun shield in place." Like, wow, right? Just wow. There's a label on a washing machine that says, "Warning, do not put persons in this washer," which I'm assuming includes like younger siblings and pets and stuff like that. There's a label on a carton of eggs that says, "Warning, may contain eggs." Right? It's like you're waiting for the drum, boom, boom. Right? There's a sticker on a wheelbarrow that says, "Not intended for highway use." Like, really? Like, who? There's a baby stroller that has a sticker that says, "Remove child before folding." Like, bro, like, who? Anyways, look, warnings show up on just about everything, and not only on sun shields and on washing machines, but they show up at church. In fact, it feels like we're warned about more things at church than anywhere else. We hear warnings about all kinds of activities and choices, and for the most part, they boil down to one word: sin. And just hearing that word brings a negative vibe, right? Whether you've been coming to church for as long as you can remember, or if this is your first time here, the idea of sin is probably pretty familiar. Now, we understand that sin is something bad and that we should avoid, but isn't it also true that when it comes to sin, we tend to think of it as a sliding scale? Here's what I mean. When we think of sin, we think that it's bad, but that surely some sins are worse than others, right? We shouldn't be disrespectful to mom, but that's way better than murder. We probably don't need to tell a lie, but hey, at least we're not stealing from people, right? We shouldn't cheat on the quiz, but hey, we didn't beat anybody up. And so eventually what that leads us to is this question: does all sin matter the same? Is it possible that we're overreacting about sins that they're not that big a deal? How much damage do these small sins really do, since they're not hurting anybody? When it comes to copying homework or breaking curfew, telling a little lie, I mean, it seems pretty harmless, right? So it definitely shouldn't be taken quite as seriously, right? So to answer these questions, we're going to go back to the book of Galatians, where we've been the last couple of weeks. And just to recap, the book of Galatians isn't a book, it's really a letters that the Apostle Paul, the most famous missionary ever, wrote to a church of new followers of Jesus in Galatia. To better understand what Paul is saying and why, it's important to know that Christianity was a new thing. People were just hearing about this Jesus guy for the first time, and when they heard the story of his life, his death, and coming back to life, man, people got hooked. Jesus came to show people a picture of God because he was God, and he talked about God's kingdom coming to earth not with force or violence, but with love and mercy and compassion. People were seeing God in a way that they had never seen before, and it really caught their attention. This was something they wanted to be a part of, but of course, that all came with questions. Everybody was trying to figure out what following Jesus should look like. And basically, they wanted to know about the sin sliding scale. When it comes to sin, what was a big deal and what wasn't? And well, Paul answers that question by writing this. He says, "You will always harvest what you plant, and those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. So let's not get tired of doing what is good, and at just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up." Galatians 6, 7b through 9. Now, you may wonder what this had to do with that question. Well, at the time, people lived in agricultural culture. The economy revolved mostly around what was planted and grown and sold. And so to this audience, it made real sense that when it comes to farming, you reap what you sow. What you plant is what you grow. And if you plant corn, you're going to grow corn stalks. What you plant determines what you harvest later. So when Paul compares choices and outcomes to planting and harvesting, they knew exactly what he meant. Paul was telling them that your choices now determine what you eventually harvest. So what's true for crops is true for your life. To put it another way, your decisions will bear fruit or have consequences. And it may not happen tomorrow, but every choice and every action plants a seed for your future. And Paul is asking, if you one day harvest what you planted, what do you want your harvest to look like? So instead of giving the Galatians a list of what sins to avoid and what sins can kind of be taken less seriously, Paul tells the Galatians, those who only live to satisfy their sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. Galatians 6:8. I know that's pretty strong language, but Paul feels strongly about what he's telling them. Paul loved those people very much, and he's telling them that bad choices lead to bad outcomes. It's just how life works. So while it may seem like Paul is answering a question that we aren't asking, the truth is he's getting right to the heart of the matter. If we're wondering what sins matter more than others, Paul's telling us that that's the wrong question to ask. Instead of saying, what can we get away with, Paul says we should be asking, what do we want to harvest? Because every decision has a harvest, and it never just stands alone with no consequences. There is always an effect. So maybe you don't consider gossip to be that big of a deal. But if you plant gossip, you will eventually get the results of gossip. You might ruin a friendship this year. Or maybe that harvest will happen in the future when someone carries your hurtful words that you said for years afterwards. Or if you continually choose not to study and you just cheat to pass your classes in high school, you may not have the foundation you need for those advanced courses when you get to college. If you continue to tell lies, you may not be trusted in the future. You continue to use drugs or alcohol or sex as coping mechanisms, you might harvest addiction or long-term results effects on your body, or just an inability to deal with things that life throws at you. When we change the question from what can I get away with to what do I want to harvest, it changes everything. If that sounds depressing, just hang on, because the good news is that what Paul says also works the other direction. If you're planting good decisions, and you're going to experience a harvest of life. If you plant stuff that gives life, the stuff Jesus talks about like joy and peace and rest and compassion, you're going to grow those things and they'll take root in your life. Jesus said, my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. John 10, verse 10. Now, some translators use the word abundant or full here instead of rich. Imagine an abundant or full harvest of things like peace and joy and satisfaction. Now, I'd love for us to start asking that question, what seeds do I want to plant and what things do I want to grow in my life? So let that be your filter we use to make decisions. For some of us, we spent a big part of our life asking the wrong questions. And I get it. Look, it's easier to know, can I do that or not, right? How bad is that thing really? But asking the wrong questions leads to harvesting the wrong things. We don't want to end up somewhere years down the road wondering, how did we get where we are? And if we use our freedom to ask, is this helpful? Is this kind? Is this the way to a more abundant life that Jesus talked about? Then we're much more likely to end up where we want to be, growing what we want to grow. Because this is true for all of us. How you use your freedom now determines your freedom later. Do you want your parents to give you more freedom later? Plant trust, respect, and honor now. Do you want healthy friendships later? Plant kindness and honesty and compassion now. Do you want freedom with your money later? Well, plant patience, self-control, and wisdom now. Following Jesus is about freedom and about life, and Jesus wants you to harvest abundant life. But you don't start a harvest with harvesting, you start with planting. And you need to know that when it comes to planting and harvesting, we aren't saying that the harvesting effects of sin or consequences of sin are God punishing you or being out to get you. It's really about us harvesting the natural consequences of sin. God isn't out to get us. He's trying to protect us from what happens when we sin. That's why God wants you to use the freedom you have to plant the kinds of things that create the life God wants for you. Sin always comes with a warning label, and it's not God's way of threatening you or scaring you. God gives us warning labels so that we can experience the freedom that comes from planting and harvesting things that are best. That kind of planting and harvesting leads to the kind of freedom and future that we really want. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out what we want to harvest long term. And that's why we do small groups, right? It's a chance to talk through some of those big questions with people going the same direction you're going and with a leader who can help you. So when you head to your small groups during the week, be thinking through how you can encourage each other to plant seeds today that lead to more freedom in the future.